Zoom has subsequently gone public and has become quite a big deal, but this is 4 or 5 years ago. They're pre-IPO. There's a small company, and their competitor is the colossal, powerful, well-known, every street corner in America feels like there's a Western Union branch, right? So you're competing against this well-known brand that's got points of distribution all over the globe, and all the remittances that are going back to India, to Mexico, to Panama, wherever the immigrant population in the US is, they're going primarily through Western Union. Now, you can imagine the mindset of that team. You walk in, they're like, wow, we think there's an opportunity here, but boy, we're tiny compared to those guys. How are we going to compete? And that, so that conversation is full of constraint. We don't have the points of presence that Western Union has. We don't have the brand recognition that Western Union has. We don't have the trust because they're big and we're new and they've never heard of us. So all these legions of things. But what we uncovered, the story that we began to tell was, Western Union is not the squeaky clean kind of, its pricing is all over the place. There's some argument to be made that some of that pricing is predatory pricing. And Zoom learned to see the situation as, really the immigrant population in the US needs more of an ally. It needs a company that's genuinely on their side. And we had some fascinating conversations about the immigrant experience. You imagine you're 19, 20 years old and you're leaving home for the first time, and you're coming from wherever you're coming from, probably an impoverished background, not particularly well educated, although that's not entirely true in some instances. And you're coming to a strange country where you may not speak the language, where you're not making a lot of money, and you've got to find your way here. And those people are very easily preyed upon, not just by, I'm not suggesting that Western Union preys on them, but there's a lot of vulnerability in that conversation. And so we began to talk about that those people needing an ally. They needed to keep the price of these remittances they were sending back home, the price for sending it as low as possible. And in that context, not having a big, expensive bricks and mortar network, which is expensive to maintain, allows Zoom to be competitive on cost. So, actually, it might be an asset, the fact that we don't have all this bricks and mortar. This is a situation where these apparent limitations, not having bricks and mortar distribution, for example, can be flipped and say, actually, you know what, there's a big opportunity there because we don't have the same cost structure. We can be much more transparent in terms of our pricing. We can bring our pricing low, and we can begin to advocate for the little guy, for these immigrants that are in this potentially, exploitative relationship, and we can be on their side. And of course, they identify with that narrative because it's their narrative. So the Zoom story is essentially the story of many of the immigrants coming to the US for the first time, making their way, sending their money home. And so they've been able to forge these really strong relationships. They've got great loyalty as a brand, and they've built a lot of business. And when we developed that narrative together, Julian King, who was my client there, the head of marketing at Zoom, said it was incredibly clarifying for them as an organization to understand what their purpose was and how some of these limitations were actually blessings in disguise. And fairly shortly after we'd finished that project, they went to Walmart and they sit down and they told that story to the Walmart buyers about why it was important for Walmart to embrace Zoom and start working together as a partner in distribution. And the story just resonated right away with that buyer because they understood the connection to their own population. So, a great example, I think, of how the challenger needs to think and how some of the concepts in this book can work to change the mindset. There's opportunity if we can learn to see these constraints in different ways as allies in our purpose and not as things that necessarily need to hold us back. And the energy that liberates and the opportunities that creates in tangible, hard ways in terms of the products and services that Zoom deliver is phenomenal. And, that's just one instance amongst many of how we change the conversation around constraints with clients and liberate all this kind of possibility for them. It's one of the things that I love about this work is you can see the lights going on. People's like, oh, wait a minute. Actually, I'd prefer to be in the challenger position. I prefer to not be encumbered with the experience, with all the enormity of, the big companies that we're competing with, whose very scale sometimes can be the thing that holds them back.
I think a lot of companies, entrepreneurs, creative-minded people often get caught into what they feel like are ruts that are cut before them. What I call turning routines into ruts, I felt like you called path dependence.
Yeah.
But they think they're caught into certain kinds of kind of rails or ruts they go into. Open that up a little bit and explain some of the ways that processes can be both liberating and confining. One of the stories that you told that I really loved was about the size of the space shuttle engines being based on the Roman road engineering.
Yeah.
So some of those thoughts of how it can both be confining, but then routines can also be liberating.
Yeah, so this is that story, by the way. I should give a shout out to Kevin Kelly, who wrote a just extraordinary book called What Technology Wants. And in it, he described that story about so I'll just tell it very, very quickly for the listeners here, that he traces, he asked the question, why is the space shuttle, so the fuel engines on the space shuttle a certain width? And it's dictated by the width of a railway line, because they've got to get these rockets to the launch pad, and that's going to be determined by these railway lines. And he keeps going backwards through time to say, well, why that width? And it all traces all the way back to the width, apparently, of a Roman chariot wheels, which, were a certain width, and that defined the width of Roman roads, and the British road builders learned to build roads to a certain width based on the Roman roads, and they came over to the States and built the US railways, and so on and so forth, all the way up to the modern day. And it's a great example of how it's what the academics called lock-in. And the QWERTY keyboard, many of people are probably with arm's reach of a keyboard. If you look at it now and you see, the top 5-6 letters there are spelled QWERTY. Why do all keyboards look that way? It's just somebody decided a long time ago that's the way they would look, and we've all become creatures of habit and locked into using that in a particular way. And so we see this playing out a lot in technology, the space shuttle story, the QWERTY keyboard. But it also is true of the way that we just go about our lives, personal lives, and our businesses, that we build habits around successful patterns. Understandably so, and rightly so. A lot of the habits that big businesses have, small businesses have, people have, are there for very good reason. They have good resumes, these habits. We did something, it worked. We paid attention to it. Hey, look, that worked. Let's do more like that. So we become better and better at doing that thing. We hire people to join our business who are really good at doing that thing too. So they help us do that thing even better. We design all of our measurement systems, all our processes and procedures around those. So we're measuring our ability to do that one thing really well. And over time, we get this thing on rails, right? And that's when businesses hit their groove and they become very successful. Eventually, those patterns of behavior, those grooves, become ruts. They dig so deep you get stuck in this rut and you can't see out the other side. The walls become so deep you don't know what's going on in the outside world anymore. And at a certain point, those habits stop serving us and start hindering us. And they stop us from seeing the opportunities in constraints, because constraints are by necessity sort of outside of the groove, right? They're the things we're trying to avoid. That we've built this groove, this pattern of behavior, in order to avoid getting stuck in those ruts and getting trapped by those constraints. And so we stop seeing them in that way. So what we propose in the book is to break path dependence periodically. Not all the time. This is not about, unleashing the beast of chaos and saying all those old behaviors no longer apply, but to be much more conscious and systematic about saying these assumptions in our model, in our processes, in our methods, need to be questioned from time to time. Are we asking the right kinds of questions of ourselves? Are we challenging ourselves sufficiently around the way that we do business? And the primary tool that we've identified here to help people and organizations break path dependence is to create what we call a propelling question. So a propelling question asks companies to and people and teams to get very clear about what their core ambitions are. And most teams are quite good at articulating that. We know what our objectives are. We've got a purpose statement. We've articulated what the future looks like. And so we'd be very clear around those, and then couple those to the constraints of the business. So very oftentimes the ambitions and constraints live in very different places. The constraints are locked in a closet. We don't talk about them out loud much, apart from maybe when we get a bit down in the dumps. We go, look at all these things that are holding us back. Bring those out of the closet, couple them to your constraints, and form a propelling question, which looks impossible to solve. And I'll give a couple of examples in a moment. But the value of framing a propelling question and coupling your ambitions and constraints together is it breaks path dependence. The answering of those kinds of questions forces you out of your ruts or grooves, depending on how well they're working for you, and onto new kinds of paths, because the sort of solutions that will help you to answer those questions are very different. So the simplest example of this, and a very real world example, is Audi in the world of motor racing. So Audi, as I'm sure everybody knows, is a big brand, but they wanted to be the most prestigious automobile brand in the world. They want to be. That's their ambition as a business, and they recognize that in order to achieve that, they need to win on the racetrack, and they select, as many car companies do, Le Mans, the 24-hour road race in France. That's a very famous test of automobiles, and they want to win that race. But the chief engineer of Audi stands up and addresses his team and says, we want to win Le Mans, but we don't have an engine that is any more powerful or better than anybody else's. So typically, motor racing companies, they pour millions of dollars into R&D to try to develop a better, stronger, faster engine that's going to help them win the race. That's what path dependence looks like. The way you win races is you build a stronger engine, the faster engine. But the chief engineer, in denying his team that, while we have an engine that's not faster than anybody else's, forced them to think about all the other ways that they might be able to win the race. And the answer, which you will know, Charles, because you've read this section of the book, I'm sure, is to use turbo diesel technology. It's a technology that Audi has. No one's used it on the racetrack before. The benefit of racing with a turbo diesel engine is it may not be as powerful and as fast, but it's more fuel efficient, and you therefore come off the track less.
Fewer times for refueling.
Yeah, exactly. And as Scott Keogh, the president of Audi, told us when he was telling us this story, he said, there is no engine that is fast enough to make up the time lost by pitting frequently on a 24-hour road race. So the year that Audi introduced the turbo diesel car, 2006, they won first, second, and third at Le Mans. It was unprecedented. They wiped the floor with everybody. And they wiped the floor with everybody because they had, by asking a different question, a challenging, impossible question, they'd broken their own path dependence, their own habitual way of thinking about what it takes to win an automobile race. It's a really simple example, but I think it's quite a profound one in terms of demonstrating just how locked in we all become in terms of how we think about our category and our business. And propelling questions are a way to kind of break that path dependence.
Well, we often think that it seems that simple things cannot be compelling, but it seems like simple things often are the most compelling because they're right in front of us if we will look at them.
Yeah, and it's, we're all of us held, I think that, who's it? I forget who said this, we don't have habits. Our habits have us.
Yes.
And that's, basically what this idea is. And it's very, you can't, it's kind of like the other lovely aphorism for this part of the conversation is a goldfish doesn't know it swims in water. You don't know that you have these habits, that these habits have you, unless you really take the time to step back from it and say, let's see if we can reveal all our path dependencies, all our habits, all our assumptions, all our models, all our mental models about how we think this category works and how we need to win in this business. And are there ways, some of these, that we can challenge and flip them upside down and reveal to ourselves that no, there are actually, in 2015, the world has changed. Our models, the models of today are actually the models of yesterday. that we've baked into the way we operate. So periodically taking some time to step back and talk about where we've become dependent on these habits and assumptions is a really important part of this process, because it frees the mind, it opens the mind,